Please watch the video until the end of it. Chapter 1. The Talisman. Thomas Reed, the narrator and a quiet man who had stood on too many shores watching boys become maps of loss, remembered the first time the photograph came into Mark Hale's life. It was a small thing, edges soft from being squeezed between pages of a well-read Bible. The image showed a woman leaning on a railing by the ocean. Hair caught in wind she did not seem to notice. There was no name, no message, only the easy, honest light of a moment. Mark found it during a patrol far from home, beneath rubble and gunmetal. Soldiers joked about Lucky Charms then because jokes are a way to keep fear from settling in. But for Mark, the photograph stopped being a talisman the night it slept under his pillow, and he woke without the dream that had followed him for weeks. The dream of not returning. From that moment the image became possibility, a quiet proof that beauty existed beyond the barrenness of war. Thomas narrated this as a man who had shared foxholes and letters. He knew how superstition turned into devotion. He had watched the way Mark would stare at the picture like a promise whispered against a storm. It was the photograph that kept him steady, the photograph that whispered a life beyond the concrete and the mortar. Chapter 2. Homecoming. When Mark came back, the town he returned to was not waiting on a pedestal. He arrived in the gray that settles between August and September in a coastal place where gulls map the skies and everything smells faintly of salt. He had no map to the woman in the photograph, only the town and the shape of a possible life. Thomas watched him re-enter the quiet of a navy blue sky and the peculiar loneliness that follows medals and the way people step around the silence of someone who has seen too much. Mark found a job at the boatyard, mending lines and polishing hulls until calluses stitched him to a rhythm that matched the tides. He rented a small room above a bakery and learned the sequence of the town's days. How Mrs. Klein opened her shutters before dawn, how the church bell counted the hours, how fishermen told the weather with half a sentence. He carried the photograph with him as one carries grief and gratitude together, in the same pocket as a lighter and the watch his father left behind. Rumors of a photograph making a man whole would have sounded foolish if Mark had shared them. He kept tight lips and quieter plans. But Thomas, who had returned a week later and stayed long enough to know the town's names, could see the slow way Mark turned longing into action. A photograph was not a map, but it had keys. It began with questions asked of bartenders, neighbors, and people who repaired things. It was a patience honed by months of waiting. Chapter 3. The Shelter on Willow Lane. Anna Sterling ran the animal shelter at the edge of town. A modest building with white paint gone slightly gray at the eaves. She had the look of someone shaped by responsibilities that were not hers by decree but adopted out of a soft stubbornness, a willingness to fix what others overlooked. Thomas had met her before he met Mark. He had the historian's memory for faces and the storyteller's appetite for how lives intersect. Anna's life was marked by a protective carefulness. After a childhood that taught her the fragility of trust, she learned to greet mornings with lists rather than with dreams. The photograph Mark carried turned out to be hers, a relic from a summer she had spent alone and braver than she felt at the time. It had slipped from the pocket of a coat in a cafe, had been picked up by a stranger who mailed it to a friend, who later found himself overseas and kept it tucked under his pillow. When Mark came to the shelter looking for a dog that did not belong to anyone and for a woman who did, Anna's reaction was cautious. She believed strangers arrived with motives and masks. Yet there was something in Mark, an unflashy patience, a steadiness, that softened her edges. The town watched them with a curiosity that small places lend to new stories. A man who seemed stitched to a photograph, and a woman who guarded her life like a darning of loose ends. Chapter 4. Ties that bind. Friendship began in the small ways. Mark lifting heavy bags of dog food, Anna teaching him how to coax a fearful spaniel from under a table, Thomas making a weary joke that loosened the day. They built trust like one builds a birdhouse. Careful measurements, repeated attempts, an imperfect but lasting shelter. Yet undertow runs beneath the surface of any seaside town. Old loyalties and scars do not dissolve with the tide. A local heir, a man with a sharp tongue and a stubborn claim on the harbor, resented Mark's presence. He saw the newcomer as a threat to the order he preferred. Appearances, ancestry, and a town where everyone remembered their place. He pushed at Mark's sense of belonging with thinly veiled barbs and with maneuvers to make the boatyard his. The cost of this pressure landed at the shelter when funding became tenuous and whispers about ownership of a plot of land found their way into conversations over coffee. Anna faced a choice: yield to pragmatic solutions or hold to what she believed belonged to the animals and to the quiet community of care she had created. Mark, who had navigated explosive fields and the subtle minds of human suspicion, found himself learning another skill: how to stand without anger, how to assert belonging without claim. Thomas observed, a man more accustomed to telling what he saw than to interfering. He saw two people learning to be brave in different ways. Chapter 5. Reckonings. Confrontation came like a storm. Sudden, loud, and then mercifully clear. The air pushed too far, and the town had to choose between old certainties and the small human argument for decency. The shelter's future hinged on proof of ownership and on the hearts of people who would stand with Anna. Mark offered what he had: not money, but the willingness to rally neighbors, to speak at the town meeting, to be a visible reason for others to vote for kindness. In the meeting hall, voices rose, old grievances were aired, and Anna spoke with an honesty that surprised those who had misread her as fragile. Mark did not speak much. Instead, he led his actions: fixing the shelter's roof, organizing volunteers, do the talking. Thomas sat at the back and watched the quiet arithmetic of courage. A man who had believed in a photograph, a woman who had believed, in small ways, in herself, and a community that sometimes needed to be reminded of what it was to be humane. After the vote, which favored the shelter by a narrow but decisive margin, Anna and Mark stood outside, the ocean breath whispering against the town. They did not need phrases to measure what had changed. One photograph had led a man home. Home had, in turn, taught him how to help build something steadier than luck. Chapter 6. A quiet beginning. The last chapter of their beginning was not cinematic in an obvious way. No sweeping declarations, no perfect ending. There was a Sunday morning when Mark and Anna walked down to the pier and fed stale bread to gulls. They talked about trivialities: what to plant along the fence, how to coax a shy dog into accepting a belly rub, and then about deeper things that feel like confession only because they are tender. Thomas, who had chosen to leave town with the satisfaction of having told a story, reflected on the odd architecture of love. Sometimes it was a photograph found in rubble. Sometimes it was a decision to stand by a place and the people who keep it breathing. For Mark, fate had been a photograph. For Anna, fate was the slow learning to let someone else carry a burden with her rather than for her. They married years later in a small ceremony at the shelter, not because the town required spectacle, but because they wanted the animals and the volunteers who had become their family to be there. Thomas read a short piece that did not claim to define their story, but to honor that chance and choice braid themselves so tightly one cannot tell which held the other first. Luck, he concluded in his slow, manly voice, is not a lightning strike that saves you once. It is a series of small, ordinary moments that add up until, without fanfare, life turns toward another and stays. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, give the video a like, leave a comment, and share the video.